Welcome to News from Neptune for May 24th in the 21st week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government a century ago, said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in this country of what the term socialist means. It's not easy, owing to generations of U.S. propaganda. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says, quote, terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism, in Karl Marx's sense, in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared in the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. Close quote. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and China notably. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available on archive.org. Archive.org. Let's get that straight. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things tonight on a Trade War for Profit edition, where we point out that U.S. foreign policy is to use war and war provocations versus China and Russia to retard Eurasian integration and assure the worldwide economic control of the American 1%. We can begin tonight with top of your list, David, if you'd like.
Yeah, I just thought I would make a note of an article that I think was referred to on the Marx Mail list by a woman named Barbara Grigorich on a website called Redline. Walt Whitman, labor journalist, poet, social radical. And a quote from this article is from Whitman's book, Democratic Vistas, published in 1871. The reason for this is we're observing the 200th anniversary of the birth of the great American poet Walt Whitman. He wrote in 1871, not in a poem, the quote, the depravity of the business classes of our country is not less than has been supposed, but infinitely greater. The official services of America, national, state, and municipal, in all their branches and departments, except the judiciary, are saturated in corruption, bribery, falsehood, maladministration, and the judiciary is tainted. In vain do we march with unprecedented strides to empire so colossal, outvying the antique, beyond Alexander's, beyond the proudest sway of Rome. Well, he did get a little poetic at the end there. So that's what Walt Whitman wrote 6 years after the end of the Civil War.
And the beginning of the Gilded Age, which lasted to the end of the century, where the economic motives behind the Civil War and the development of the American capitalist class was outlined in ever more striking detail to most Americans. Americans came to understand what it was that had triumphed in the Civil War, and the result was the great movement towards unionism and socialism in the United States in the last years of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century. It's not going too far to say that the Wilson administration maneuvered America into the First World War precisely to handle the challenge that was coming to American business and American capitalist ruling class from the labor movement and the socialist movement in the country. So these, in the old SDS motto, everything is connected, huh?
Yep. Just one more note here before we actually go on to more substantive stuff, because I know, Carl, how much you love the Kennedy family. This was a little blurb actually in the local newspaper, but from the AP wire, Dateline Boston. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has been honored with the 2019 John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award. Pelosi was recognized for her efforts to pass former President Barack Obama's 2010 health care law and for helping Democrats reclaim control of the U.S. House during last year's elections. Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of the late president, calls the California Democrat, quote, the most important woman in American political history, end quote. Kennedy said Pelosi, who has served in the House since 1987, that's 32 years in case you're counting, quote, leads with strength, integrity, and grace under pressure, end quote, from Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of our late president.
And it's important to see that the Kennedy legacy, if we want to put it that way, is indeed carried out by the contemporary Democratic Party. When you remember that the real legacy is the stoppage of progress towards a more economically just society. Even the health bill, the Obamacare mentioned at the beginning of that note, is a program that was designed to maintain the profits of the American medical establishment and frustrate the straightforward attempt to Medicare for all that we see represented in the Democratic Party, in the central councils of the Democratic Party today, and notably Nancy Pelosi. They're plus ça change, you know. Liberalism's task is to retard social progress.
Yep. So, your turn.
Okay. All right. In the terms,
I've got other stuff, but your turn for now.
In terms of retarding progress, we might look at the shocking responses by the federal government and even more by the American press to the WikiLeaks story and the persecution of Julian Assange. Ecuador, the government of Ecuador, which granted Assange asylum and then revoked the asylum with a change in government in Ecuador and gave Assange over into the hands of the British police. They have now handed over Assange's materials, the things that he compiled while he was staying in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, to those same British police. And the WikiLeaks people say there's no doubt that Ecuador had tampered with Assange's property and in trying to build a case against him. And indeed, that case expanded this week. 17, count them, 17 new criminal charges from the United States heaped upon Julian Assange in a superseding indictment, superseding the indictment that has already been handed down by the U.S. courts. There's comments about this on the fringes of the American media, but very little centrally in American media. A good article by WikiLeaks editor Kristen Hrafson we'll post on the News from Neptune Facebook page. The Intercept's Glenn Greenwald is writing about it, as is former NSA contractor and leaker Edward Snowden. And journalist John Pilger. These are all comments on the Assange case and this remarkable use of the Espionage Act, which itself was a repressive measure from the First World War, against Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And people realize that this is all flagrantly in violation of the First Amendment. But you won't hear much about that in mainstream media, unfortunately. Comments.
But the New York Times does seem alarmed at what the implications are of this particular charge. Even the New York Times.
Even the New York Times.
Yeah.
They might be because it's obvious that the sorts of things that are being alleged about Assange could be used just as easily against the New York Times and any other news gathering and news presenting organization. And the Pentagon Papers case in which the charges like this were contemplated by the government against the New York Times, in a sense, were dismissed on a technicality. And the fundamental issues of exposing things that the government doesn't want to be exposed, usually accounts of crimes by the American government, that issue has not gone away. And that's central to the current debate. And the forces of repression are winning. And Julian Assange remains imprisoned. This is a scandal, nothing less. Snowden himself wrote, "The Department of Justice has just declared war, not on WikiLeaks, but on journalism itself. This is no longer about Julian Assange. This case will decide the future of media." And that, by the way, is quoted by the self-same New York Times. So your notion that they're a little worried may well be right.
Yeah.
John Pilger, the Australian journalist and filmmaker who has been excellent on these matters for a long time, writes, "The war on Julian Assange is now a war on all. 18 absurd charges, including espionage, send a burning message to every journalist, every publisher. The target today is Assange. Tomorrow, it will be you on the New York Times, you on the BBC. Modern fascism is breaking cover." Close quote. Now that's, as I say, the Australian John Pilger. The word fascism has been tossed about with remarkable aplomb in the last year or two, and we've had occasion to criticize its use here. But now suddenly it reappears in the control of the press that was typical of the fascist regimes of the early 20th century, and this done by good American patriots. It is not a pretty sight.
You know, what I see is symptomatic of fascism in a word which I rarely use, especially in the current political context, when people talk about Trump this and Trump that. But when I think about fascism, I think about the idea that everybody has to think alike. And even if you don't think alike, you better keep your mouth shut. And that feeling always occurs to me when I attend a Major League Baseball game, as I did at Wrigley Field this past Wednesday evening, in spite of having a rollicking good time. And what occurred to me, not only in the national anthem and so forth, the sort of military recognition that goes on at sporting events routinely these days, and what particularly caught my eye was the fact that apparently the Cubs they said something about the Cubs having a partnership with Boeing Corporation to do to do this military. So I went and Googled it, and I came up with this article from January of last year, before the previous baseball season, from sportsbusinessdaily.com. Cubs signed 3-year deal with Boeing that includes series of military recognitions by a fellow named Eric Fisher. The Cubs, which is owned by this fantastically wealthy hedge fund family, the Ricketts family, the hedge fund, Wall Street, the whole business. The Cubs have signed a 3-year, $3 million partnership with Boeing that will create a series of military recognitions, both at Wrigley Field and around the world. Activations, whatever that means, will include a military salute in the 4th inning of every Cubs home game, which was what caught my eye on Wednesday evening. A first pitch at every Sunday home game by either active or retired military personnel, and the creation of several military-themed days in the team's schedule. The agreement also is slated to include the creation of a VR, virtual reality experience, from, in, and around Wrigley Field, featuring Cubs players and coaches that will be shown at U.S. military bases around the world. The VR content will be developed during the season with meant last season, with a yet to be determined vendor. On and on. Each activation will contain branding. I haven't seen the word activation used in this context. I have a feeling that's a sort of a PR word that I don't.
Advertising.
Activation. So so I learned something new.
We've got an activation for you here.
Yeah.
Buy stuff.
Yeah. And so they go on to quote Tom Ricketts, the Cubs chair. The effort will also involve the USO, which includes et cetera, tie-ins, et cetera. And then Tom Ricketts, and then somebody is quoted, Boeing chair, president and CEO Dennis Muhlenberg, quote, "We thought a lot about different types of partnerships with the Cubs, and I'd been friendly with Tom Ricketts for a long time." You know, these people run in the same circles. But as we discussed this, says Tom Muhlenberg, with Tom Ricketts, we both thought we could do something that could be really differentiated and convey a sense of support for our servicemen and women, end quote. The company, meaning Boeing, apparently, has more than 20,000 military veterans among its employees.
Rickets is a crippling disease from youth, is it not?
It is.
I see.
From what I'm, yes.
So we're concretizing a metaphor here.
Yes, right. Yeah. And if you want a little tie-in here, a little current tie-in, I have to say that something I had on my list here that I didn't use on a past show, but this is a good time for it. From Naked Capitalism, April 27th, an article by a fellow named Marshall Auerbach, called "Boeing Might Represent the Greatest Indictment of 21st Century Capitalism." This is even apart from the military sort of dependence on, and this of course is related to the recent crashes of Boeing planes. And what Marshall Auerbach writes here, a veteran commercial pilot and software engineer with over 3 decades of experience has just written the most damning account of the recent Boeing 737 fiasco. At one level, author Gregory Travis has provided us with the most detailed account of why a particular plane model, once synonymous with reliability, became a techno-death trap. But ultimately, his story is a parable of all that is wrong with 21st century capitalism. Boeing has become a company that embodies all of its worst pathologies. It has a totally unsustainable business model, one that has persistently ignored the risks of excessive offshoring, the pitfalls of divorcing engineering from basic R&D function, the perils of demodularization, quote unquote, and the perverse incentives of shareholder capitalism, quote unquote, whereby basic safety concerns have repeatedly been sacrificed at the altar of greed. So here, even apart from the militarism, which Boeing sort of maintains this dual identity of passenger airplanes, but as a military contractor, that's its bread and butter. I don't know what the balance is there. But there we go. I mean, it's all we have to do is look around here, look around there, do a little Googling, make connections between the militarism, and we get back to this basic idea that at a game at Wrigley Field, people are expected, and pretty much by and large, in a way that is frightening to me, go along with this stuff. Cheer wildly for the military veteran that they trot out there, hold their caps over their hearts for the national anthem, etc.
And this is
I don't know.
this is hardly new. I mean,
that is fascism.
In the sense, the forms that this takes are worth winkling out in the day-to-day specifics of American capitalism and the attendant politics. But there is a basic arrangement here that's worth noting, and that these discussions of U.S. foreign policy and trade wars should alert us to. This is, I said that today's program was a trade for profit edition with reference to those wars. And we have to remember that at the very heart of American foreign policy for a very long time has been the use of war and war provocations against Russia and China particularly to retard Eurasian integration, that is the integration of the greater part, physically the greater part of the world, for fear that economic integration will lead to challenges to the hegemony of American capitalism and a frightening lessening of the profits of the American 1%. It's very difficult to ignore the connections between a flyover at Wrigley Field and the American 1%'s profit from its economic control of the world. Instead of looking at possibilities that would enhance economic integration for the world at large and raise the general standard of living, instead we have a beggar my neighbor approach of America to Eurasia that hurts everybody, and the talks about Trump and trade wars only heightens what is the general situation, only brings to our attention what is the general situation and has been at least since the end of the Second World War. So the past is prologue, as they say.
Yeah, I want to drop in relation to the trade wars, I want to drop in a reference to a Dean Baker article about what it is really these trade wars are really about and not about in relation to the value of the currency, patent protection, and all of that's going on. And in fact, as with everything else, Donald Trump has come around to the ruling class view, where he was concerned about he had a valid, genuine concern about the undervaluing of Chinese currency. What that shifted into is this idea that Chinese stealing our stuff, they're stealing our technology, they're stealing our patents, and Dean Baker and in the context of his usual critique of Dean Baker's economic critique of the things economists say, the crazy things economists say. What he does is sort out what these issues are, and what they've got Trump to do is to shift his concern in favor of the ruling class, in favor of the protection of patent rights and intellectual property and all that stuff, all the stuff that Dean Baker is always harping about in relation to the way our corporate system works and the way our trade system works.
You're watching News from Neptune, our attempt each week to talk about the news of the week and its coverage by the media and put it into some sort of context with the ongoing procedures of the American empire. It is not a pretty picture. We need a discussion, David, at some point.
Yes, I've been meaning to talk to you about
that. Should rehearse.
Yeah.
Should rehearse this
What is it
discussion.
we're talking about? Okay.
MMT. Modern monetary theory. You talked about that on the program before.
Yeah.
But it's there have been it's flying under the radar, so to speak, to keep our military analogies going. But it is a very real discussion about which there is not much agreement. The presenting symptom, so to speak, is the question of the United States borrowing money in order to finance its various activities around the world, notably war, not activities that help people, but activities that kill people. You don't hear too much discussion in this century or the previous one about how much this war policy of the United States is going to cost. But that's a very real issue. And the question of where a government particularly the government of the United States, obtains the money that it uses to kill people around the world, does have some features of interest. You've stressed the important point that the economics of a government are not like those of the family, where the question is simply, do we have enough income to cover our needs? It's another matter entirely, and it constructs money in a process that is bound up with governance. Now, there are ways in which this can be understood, and there's, as I say, not a complete agreement. A friend of this program, Doug Henwood, who has for years run the Left Business Observer, a publication that has fed into his work in broadcasting the news in recent years, talked about the political implications of the government economy when it was not much being done. It was simply taken as a given. The modern monetary theory has critics on the left, as we say, as well as on the right, and it is in some ways an elaboration of the old rightist mantra, deficits don't matter, and an explanation about why, or the extent to which that's true. But there's a lot more to be said about it, and it may be important, I'm not entirely sure it is, but it may be important particularly when we hear arguments, which we are more frequently now, about things such as universal medical care. The notion that we can't possibly afford universal medical care in the way that France and Portugal do seems bizarre on the face of it. But to try to counter that particular argument without talking about where the government's money comes from is probably useless. We need the discussion.
Yes, we do. And one part of that, of course, is about modern monetary theory and where the government money comes from. And just to slightly amend your statement, it's the government that has a sovereign currency, which the European Union doesn't. So countries in the European Union,
the European Union
very
as a
different.
Whole. Right.
So the euro can't be thought of in the same way as the U.S. dollar in that sense.
Right.
But anyway, that aside, the other misunderstanding, of course, has to do with how much. In the case of healthcare, how much universal healthcare would really cost. And of course, people might ask, again, if they're asking common sense questions like where does our money come from, they might ask, well, if our per capita healthcare cost is going to be less, as it is in every other developed country with universal healthcare, why is it we can't afford to pay for it? It's only the fact that the government is paying for it. Well, the government now pays for 2/3 of our expensive healthcare system through Medicare, through the government through Medicaid, and through the government coverage of its own workers. So all those things account already for 2/3 of healthcare, of our non-universal healthcare system. And the question is how can we not afford to pay less money given the fact that it's going to be less money coming out of employers' pockets and people's pockets and more money out of the government or the quote-unquote taxpayers. But then the question only becomes a kind of technical one as to how the government will provide that money and how it will, and what compensatory taxation should go along with that.
But we hear people, including Democrat liberals, soi-disant liberals, saying that, well, of course, universal Medicare for all is a good idea, but we can't afford it. Now, this is patent nonsense. And it's probably necessary and worthwhile to explain why it's patent nonsense. But it's being used as an argument against a healthcare system even approaching what the other developed capitalist economies have. And that's a scandal.
Yeah. There's two references to that. One, I think Dean Baker wrote a paper about it that is perfectly readable, and that delves too much into the technical details, losing sight of the fact that healthcare is going to end up being cheaper in relation to the national economy, the GDP. But still, he explains how all of that might work. And the other person I think who's dealt with that issue with is a fellow named Matt Brunig with the People's Policy Project. So I think it's easy for people who want to delve into some of the wonkier aspects of this to understand. But again, the primary thing to understand is it's just a matter of shifting into a system that is going to end up costing less a percent of our $20 trillion GDP, which is now like $3 trillion of which is on healthcare now, which really should only end up being less than $3 trillion. And if it were more like Britain, it would be more like 1.5 or 2 trillion. That leaves other money, meaning other labor used for other purposes.
We'll put some notes on this question on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. These notes are provided by our chief researcher, Jeff Nicholson. And Jeff also sends us some other labor notes that are particularly interesting in this connection. Amazon, you've heard of them. Amazon is trying to incentivize some of its employees to shift from their current job as employees of Amazon to become independent delivery drivers for the company. That is, with their own company that then contracts with Amazon. Same people doing the same job, but under a different description, crafted by this company that is there to make Jeff Bezos money. The idea is to shift some of the costs of delivery to the driver. There's a great, with the decline of American retailing in several ways, there is a great shift now to online purchasing and therefore a contest about how your purchases are going to be delivered. Amazon is racing to deliver packages faster, as their advertising tells you, and it's turning to its employees with a proposition: quit your job and Amazon will help you start a business delivering Amazon packages. Now, this is very interesting, and what the material that Jeff Nicholson has provided us points out is that, in fact, this is another example of that austerity campaign that in America is not called by that name. Only the Europeans talk about austerity campaigns. But in America, it is very much in existence and is affecting a lot of these things that have to do with transportation delivery. Most notably, Uber and Lyft are involved in what is called generally the gig economy, where people work as private contractors rather than employees and therefore give up the sort of protections that employees of large corporations have developed over generations in America. And who thought of that? Who thinks that's a good idea? Well, strangely enough, those big corporations like Amazon. And so Amazon will say, hey, we've got a deal for you. We'll set you up as a private contractor, and you can contract with us to do the same thing you've done all along without any of those nasty union protections and so forth that your father and grandfather and great-grandfather put together.
The word independent is supposed to have some great ring to it, you know.
Yeah.
Who doesn't want to be independent, right?
It's a complicated issue, but as I say, the case of Uber and Lyft have pointed it up, I think, for a lot of people. And I'll have to say that, there are definite possibilities here all over. Yeah. I have to admit that I, who never really took cabs much wherever I live, do use Uber and Lyft. And it's not just because I'm getting old and they want to take my license away, although that's another story. It's because the model has certain forms of convenience. And that's the reason that it's able to undercut the private ride-for-hire system that's developed in this country over the last century.
Yeah, I mean, these issues are complicated on many levels. The whole cab issue that the New York Times has been covering in terms of horrible stories about people being sucked into becoming cab drivers and borrowing all this money to have the right to drive a cab in New York City are being screwed. But the whole Uber Lyft thing and the kind of monopolistic taxi cab system that you find in major cities has always been scandalous and not well run. It should be being well run as a public utility. It should have always been that way, but it hasn't been, and certain people have profited greatly from that. And now Uber and Lyft undermine that in ways that are also not wholly ethical. But you need transportation, even at the level of cab driving or car driving, as a public utility in some rational way.
And we have to realize that this is all a part of the larger scene of American labor, which really has gone through two major transformations, or two major periods of development since the Second World War. And the second period of development, from about the 1970s to the present, has been a period of austerity, a strike back against any gains made by American labor in the earlier part of the century. And the companies are winning. It's not just Bezos who is doing well out of this, thank you. The fact of the matter is that American wages, which rose steadily from the end of the Second World War and the Reconstruction after the Second World War to the 1970s, were reversed in the 1970s and have been essentially flat since the 1970s. This is not a matter of weather. That's not what caused it. What caused it was the careful decision of American business in the years during and after the political protests of the Vietnam War to decide to counter the movement towards democracy that the post-war American society insisted upon, in democracy in a practical sense, democracy in terms of control of the economy and the greater prosperity of American workers. That was ended by American business in the 1970s under the name of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism being the rights of capital, the destruction of those modifications of capitalism that went back to the beginning of the New Deal, and the development of an American austerity, although we don't use the word here, parallel to austerity in Europe. The situation that has meant that American wages have been flat for 40 years is part and parcel of the American political and economic system situation that only rarely surfaces. I mean, the one thing to be noted about the Trump election, whatever you think of Donald Trump, the one thing to be noted about that is that the reason Trump is president is that Americans realized that their standard of living was being confiscated, that the possibilities that existed for the parents of the current generation or the grandparents didn't exist for them, and that led to a disillusion with those politicians who were offering hope and change and then not producing it, and the suggestion that a counter to the American economic structure, such as it existed in the previous generation, was going to be necessary in order to make America great again. And I don't think that we've properly understood how most Americans understood that phrase with reference to what they knew about their own situation. And as I say, whatever you think of Trump, it's worthwhile to recognize the forces that made him president, regardless of his unwillingness, as David suggested, to act on those matters. This is a serious matter, and the story isn't over.
Yeah, I wanted to refer to one other more complicated aspect of this whole of the healthcare business, and in relation to capitalism. One might ask why do business employees, why do corporate CEOs want those that do pay for their employees' health care, or for most of it anyway? Why do they want to do that? Wouldn't they want a cheaper system and a public system? And there are multiple reasons why it's difficult to make that shift, because as long as there as long as their workers are dependent on getting their health insurance from them, then that makes for obedient and compliant workers who are less likely to go to a job where you don't have health care.
Exactly.
Why do they want to pay so much money for it? Well, you would think that the non-healthcare companies would be looking at the healthcare companies and say, why do you cost so much? But that's a problem that you could talk about in intercapitalist relations. I mean, the ruling class always has issues with each other. They're in different sectors. There's the finance sector, there's the healthcare sector, there's the high-tech sector, the industry sector. There's all those sectors, and they all have different interests in terms of what they do, how they make their profits. But they all agree that they need to make profits. And so you aren't going to find Jeff Bezos, as far as I know, messing with the idea that there ought to be private healthcare insurance corporations and pharmaceutical corporations making these exorbitant profits. Because if the people start saying, well, you shouldn't be making a profit, well, why shouldn't be making a profit about Amazon? Why shouldn't, if we can make public the delivery of healthcare, why can't we make public the delivery of books to your door?
And although the corporate media, what we call the mainstream media and so forth, always owned by the largest corporations and administered by them, though the corporate media ignores these stories, ignores the real development of the American economy in the current generation, the word sometimes gets out. Our researcher, Jeff Nicholson, points out to a couple of recent accounts of how young people, my emotion now, young people, well, that's that includes a lot of folks.
That includes it actually me, right?
Young people are you, it includes you.
It includes me.
Happy birthday, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah. Young people are more pessimistic about their future than has been the case in American society for a long time. Our producer, who is a young person, is nodding across the room vigorously. It's the first reaction I've gotten out of him in a while. So this is, I think, we're on to something with this story.
Yeah.
Bloomberg, of all places, and by the way, somebody was complaining last week that I was spending too much time quoting the business press.
No,
I responded,
that's right.
a point that Noam Chomsky makes
Yes.
frequently, that if you want to know what's going on in the country, don't read the political press, that is the front page of the Washington Post or the New York Times and so forth. Read the business press. The political press is there to spread the propaganda. The business press is catering to those who need to know what's going on for their own business interests. So look at the business press. Bloomberg is worthwhile watching. Don't believe everything you hear, but and certainly don't buy the attitudes, but or even if you buy the stocks. But the information is likely to be better. Bloomberg runs an article, Millennials and Generation Z are increasingly pessimistic about their lives, surveys find. That's the headline. Deloitte has released its Global Millennial Survey, all in caps, of 13,400 millennials. A millennial, by the way, is someone born between the early 80s and the early 90s. I have some friends in that range. And the survey that Bloomberg took in 40 countries of 3,000 respondents, the 3,000 respondents to their questionnaire came from 10 countries. So it's not just American, but it's centered, of course, on the American generation. The firm has conducted this survey for a number of years. The percentage of respondents who think that businesses are making a positive impact dropped 6 points from 61% in 2018 to 55%. Now, that's a measure of attitude. That's what people are thinking. But people know their own situations, even if the proper interpretation of that situation may have been prevented by the sort of nonsense that the mainstream media points out. Generally, over half of both groups, the millennials born from the 80s on and Generation Z born from the 90s on, generally over about half of both groups Only about half of both groups aspire to purchase a home, and even fewer desire to start a family. Instead, travel and seeing the world was at the top of the list of aspirations, the report said. In other words, the accounts of a prosperous life that were taken for granted by the parents of these generations have been abandoned with a inchoate perhaps but accurate understanding of the possibilities of the way in which neoliberalism has asserted the rights of capital and the attempt to forestall objections that is at the heart of neoliberal propaganda have been essentially successful. This was the survey, the Bloomberg survey goes on to say that climate change, protecting the environment, natural disasters top the list of most respondents on a personal level, but less than 3 in 10 of both the Millennial and Generation Z cohorts cited it as a worry. The next highest concern for millennials is income inequality or distribution of wealth. Terrorism, crime, and concerns about personal safety are also high on the list. Who encourages these concerns? The 2020 U.S. election will be the first in which nearly all members of Generation Z will be able to cast their vote for president, as the millennials were in the last election. The difference between Generation Z and millennials is, according to the survey, much more visible when making a comparison across countries. In China and India, Generation Zs were more optimistic about the future. Meanwhile, youth in major economic powers were pessimistic about the world and whether their place in it will improve. I think the important thing here is to realize that people may listen to the news and get views from that, but most people know what their own situation is. And it's that recognition of one's own situation, however inaccurately portrayed in the general media, that leads to the sort of populist uprising that produced Donald Trump as president and has produced governments in places as unlikely as India and maybe even Germany now. The populism as a objection to the control of the economy and the confiscation of life chances is a very real concern, and it's a concern to people who might be affected by that, notably our rulers. So the attention of the business press to what people think is a key to what has actually happened in the lives of these younger people, millennials and Generation Z.
Which includes both of our children.
Yeah, exactly.
Children,
Right.
our own children. Anyway, thank you for that. I just wanted to sort of broach a topic here, Carl, which we probably don't have time to go into great length.
Okay.
But I wanted to broach it for now. There's a fellow named Cedric Johnson, who's a professor of black politics, et cetera, up at UIC, University of Illinois, Chicago, who is a kind of a colleague of the group of African American related historians and political scientists that have sort of had their tutelage under Adolph Reed in the various places that Adolph Reed has been. So this fellow Cedric Johnson has a couple of articles I want to refer to here briefly that address the topic that is kind of a hot topic in my little world, was the New Deal racist? And this is the thing that has been taken up, especially on the Marx Mail list, as this idea that, well, we can't really look back to the New Deal because it was racist. And I think what Cedric Johnson has done, and Adolph Reed and other people have done, is complicate this idea that the New Deal was racist by talking about what the relations of blacks were to the New Deal and how that relates to black politics in general. And the two Cedric Johnson articles I just want to refer to, even though I don't have time to read much, to say much about them. One was in the first issue of The Catalyst, which is the Jacobin sort of scholarly journal, and it was called "The Panthers Can't Save Us Now." And that was in 2017. And the more recent one, which is on the Jacobin website, the one on Catalyst, some of the stuff on Catalyst is behind a paywall, but this article by Cedric Johnson is not. The other article by Cedric Johnson recently is called What Black Life Actually Looks Like. And anybody who's really interested in delving into some of these issues and spending a little time at some length about the issues that are facing black politics in the post Obama era, the post Black Lives Matter era, really should be reading this stuff. The specific thing I want to refer to as a kind of basis for this, just because I was attracted to this particular description on Counterpunch recently by actually it was an article late last year by a guy named Stephen Colatrella, who is an Italian, who is a person of U.S. birth, who teaches actually at an Italian university. And in the context of a long article called Capitalism in the United States and Europe, based on an expansive lecture, which is well worth reading, long but well worth reading, Stephen Colatrella wrote this about the New Deal in the context I won't explain, but still just this is what our country did in the mid-1930s when it had half the population that it did now, and that it was obviously under a lot of economic issues or challenging economic issues. And what Stephen Colatrella wrote about this was the following: during the New Deal era, in just 3 years of activity from 1935 to 1938, the Works Progress Administration, a major New Deal program to create jobs for the unemployed, built 29,000 new bridges, 357 airports, 15,000 parks, 11,000 swimming pools, 6,000 miles of public water systems, 4,000 dams, and another 26,000 erosion control dams, 9,000 miles of sewer, 544 sewage treatment plants, 3,500 new libraries, and its employed librarians cataloged 27 million books. It built thousands of public buildings, schools, hospitals, city halls, stadiums, rodeo grounds, golf courses, and more. Its employees taught hundreds of thousands to read, created lasting works of public art, performed thousands of theatrical plays, and so on. The New Deal CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, reforested millions of acres of North America to prevent soil erosion, making continued agricultural production possible and maintaining our national forests. The New Deal also provided electricity to most of the American South through a public corporation called the Tennessee Valley Authority. After the war, and then he goes and talked about the federal money that was used after the war as a kind of continuation of the New Deal, although under more defense auspices, like the interstate highway system. And the Kennedy administration provided the space program with the resources to go to the moon, and of subsequent administrations enabled states to vastly expand state university systems. The Army Corps of Engineers actually maintains the Mississippi River in its current position to keep New Orleans, the largest port in the U.S., at the mouth of the river. And what became the internet is the result of research by the U.S. military. However, he concludes in this part, the Reagan administration, since the Reagan administration, the nation's infrastructure has not really been maintained, and most of the New Deal structures are still in use without having been adequately maintained or restored. So we are still living in the U.S. on the legacy of FDR and the New Deal. When we drive on roads, use schools, go to the hospital, drive over bridges. Still, the U.S. government, and this is his key point, the relationship between the state and government and capitalism, still the U.S. government has essentially created the environment of North America and its infrastructure from the very beginning, referring back to sort of Alexander Hamilton, etc. And he refers to somebody who says that the public actually invests more in the business sector even today than the business sector does in itself. And that's sort of the basic understanding that I want to get across here, that capitalism is, referring back to your comment in the start of the program, we talk about capitalism, we talk about socialism. We have capitalism dependent, as it always has been, especially in this country, based on government funding.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 21st week of 2019, a trade war for profit edition. U.S. foreign policy is to use war and war provocations versus China and Russia to retard Eurasian integration and assure the worldwide economic control of the American 1%. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young with Andrew Scholarly. See the research notes that we've been quoting from on the Facebook page for News from Neptune, particularly those of J.B. Nicholson. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune. To remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.